Hello, welcome to ReArm Europe. Today we have the famous 5 Brussels debunkers ready to jump into today's episode. We will be covering ReArm Europe, the Commission's fantastic new initiative to restart the arms industry. After 80 years of peace, Europe's back to war. Old habits die hard. I'm David, today's host, along with our guests Leonard, Emilia, Selina, and Eric. Hello, I'm David Auberger. I'm French and Italian, and I study international relations and organizations at Leiden University.
Hello, I'm Selina. I'm Dutch and I study psychology also at Leiden University.
Hi, I'm Eric. I am Polish and I study international studies, specializing in Europe, also at Leiden.
I'm Emilia. I also study international studies, specializing in Europe and French at Leiden University.
Yes, I'm Leonard. I'm from Germany and I study security studies also here at Leiden University.
And here today with us we have Julius Fintelman, who is one of the co-founders and current editor-in-chief of the European Correspondent. They launched their daily newsletter in November 2022 and covered the most important developments in Europe in the form of a daily newsletter as well as a weekly overview in case you want a more summarized version of what is happening in Europe that week. They are an award-winning community-founded European media organization who so kindly responded to our outreach to contribute to this podcast and offer their incredible, valuable insights upon the developments in the region.
About myself, I'm Julius. I am the editor-in-chief of the European Correspondent. I co-founded it as well, and I live in Brussels now. I was in Turkey before getting expelled. I studied in Amsterdam, so also in the Netherlands. I did international law, and I've been a journalist for the last few years, and sort of now leading this organization and our newsroom.
The SAFE initiative, which is shared by the European Commission, it emphasizes buying European within the framework of ReArm Europe, and we see this as a move to obviously boost the EU's defense industry. But we want to ask if you believe that this is simply about economic sovereignty and strengthening local industry or regional industry, or is this a deliberate move away from relying on American-made weapons and systems?
On the one hand, it is about economic sovereignty. I mean, if you boost your own local defense, if you boost your own local industries, your defense industries, that has very positive impact for your economy, right? Like you can create jobs essentially through buying weapons locally. On the other hand, there is a security risk attached to buying American weapons. There were these rumors that American producers have installed kill switches in their weapon systems, like F-16s and others. As far as I know, as far as I've been following it, that rumor has been debunked. There are no such kill switches. But still the case is that these systems oftentimes rely on when you want to repair them, when you want to upgrade them, you rely on parts from the US. So if there is a scenario where the US becomes an adversary to Europe or if Europe gets into a military conflict and the US does not support Europe in that conflict, they would have an option to say, okay, well, then we're just not going to send you the materials that you need to repair your weapons. And I believe that there's also a message that it sends that, hey, we now spend billions and billions of euros. Why should we spend this in America if they don't want us to spend it there? And if, we as Europe, we need strategic sovereignty in every sense of the word. And I think that begins with where we buy our weapons.
And would we, in short term, if there would be a war, if there would be any problems, why we would use our defense, could we rely on the European weapons, or would it be on short term easier and better to use the American ones?
Well, I mean, the issue is that there are certain key weapon systems that Europe just doesn't produce as much. Long-range air defense missiles, for example. The same goes for missiles themselves. As far as I know, long-range missiles themselves are largely American. Plus a lot of cyber intelligence, a lot of cyber intelligence. There, the US is just because of the huge budget that they have put into defense and what they've been doing over the last decades. So in the short term, the outlook that Europe can defend itself with just European weapons and without American support is quite bleak. The same also goes for manpower, right? So the US I think the US stations around 100,000 troops in Europe. In case of war, they would rapidly deploy another 200,000 troops. That's more than the army of Germany. So there's also an issue of manpower. And I think when we talk about rearming Europe and ramping up our defense capabilities, a lot of problems, like building missile systems and whatnot, they will go away if we give enough money into the industry and if we throw enough money at the problem. The issue that I see that I have not also seen a good solution to is how do we get people to sign up to an army? How do we get the manpower that is needed? Because yeah, I mean, we need much more troops. So I have not really seen a good solution to how we get our armies to actually boost manpower. In fact, the German army, if we stay on that example, they keep losing soldiers every year. But how do we get people to realize that we do need these armies and we do need to serve? That is a challenge that is significantly, I think, more tricky than even trickier than building up our defense capabilities.
There is talk of possible introduction of conscription models, especially those, for example, that Sweden or Denmark use, or Norway, I believe. Could this be a viable option to adapting this lack of a willing manpower pool to be used for European defense?
I mean, if you look at the German example, now the new incoming government is saying that it will first introduce a Swedish model. But I think mandatory conscription is coming across the board. That is a trend that I don't really see not happening. But even then, the question remains of, okay, well, now you introduce mandatory conscription, but then people are just going to be there for a year, maybe opt out and do civil service instead. The question then still remains, okay, now you force them to, but does that mean that they are more actually people see the reason why they do that? And I think there is a lot of convincing needed and a lot of PR management in the end needed to show people that this is necessary.
There was also a recent proposal from, I think it was Donald Tusk's government in Poland, about a not forced conscription, but to provide military training to all adult men in the country in order to make it easier to make them ready for war in the event of the need for forced conscription. Is that another possible model we could follow?
Probably, yeah. I mean, I'm not too much of an expert on how you rearm, how you properly build up your military in that sense. But I would argue, yeah, I think any one of these initiatives that we see probably has its impact. If you find ways to transport that sort of feeling of readiness in the whole of society, I think that is what you're looking for, right? Is like, okay, can we find systems and approaches and incentives that will get people to understand, yeah, we as society need to be ready for what may be coming. Mandating everyone to undergo some kind of training, some kind of common experience as well may help.
ReArm Europe feels driven by the Commission. It's not national governments that are driving this. It does feel like a shift in terms of how much space the Commission. Do you believe that then this marks a kind of turning point where the EU is starting to act more as a political union in matters of defense? So is this emblematic of a broader evolution towards a more federal Europe as such, or is it more of a one-off response to the current threats and developments?
The EU has always, I think in the last decade, the EU has always gotten stronger in these crises, right? It's like in COVID, it's the first time that the EU took up bonds together, joint debt. Now it's going to do it again, these 150 billion that are part of ReArm Europe. I believe that is a sign that Europe is rapidly sort of forming and becoming of a stronger union, and I would even say it goes beyond just the EU, right? I mean, this necessarily includes Norway and the UK as well. Well, certainly the Commission is taking more action, but then again, it's been rebranded from ReArm Europe to what is it now? Readiness 2030, because Italy and Spain don't want to talk about rearmament as much. So you still have that element, and the question is, how soon can will this plan actually start to unfold? What I've seen over the last few months, ever since Trump was inaugurated, and especially also after the security conference in Munich. I think Europe, like, I feel that European leaders have gotten it somewhat together. It seems much more united than before. They seem much more coordinated than before. They meet a lot more. They talk a lot more. They talk about much more common goals, and they've really somewhat rallied behind also Ukraine to an extent that we've seen in the beginning of the war in 2022, of the invasion in 2022, but we haven't really seen since then. But I think if this will transpire into the EU becoming as the construction of like the EU as that construct, if that is the sort of where it ends, or if there is a different kind of defense body where it will end in, is to be seen. Because one big issue with the EU and with defense is that and with foreign policy as well, is that it all needs to be, as you know, it all needs to be agreed upon by everyone. And with Hungary and with Slovakia and with potential future other troublemakers, that is very difficult to achieve. So there are also pushes from different advocates and different scientists and researchers that say, yeah, well, maybe defense should not be part of the EU, but we need a new defense community that encompasses the UK and encompasses everyone that is actually willing to work on European defense. There was in the 50s, maybe you're familiar with this, European Defense Community, which was basically this body of, before the EU even existed, this body of this idea that, yeah, maybe we as Europe should put our armies together and create a joint European Defense Union. And that treaty, it's a treaty that was signed by 6 countries, ratified by 4, and ratification is only still needed by Italy and France. If those countries were to ratify that treaty now, if those parliaments were to ratify that treaty, this defense community would in theory start to exist. So we have their blueprint of a defense community that works outside of the EU structures. And I think the urgency of this situation requires us to look for more creative solutions, different solutions that maybe go beyond just the EU. And that kind of defense community may be an answer, or something similar. I don't know if it will be EU or if it will be a different body. There are arguments made that it should maybe be outside of the EU scope to make it easier and faster to act.
I think bringing up such old defense treaties is a very interesting prospect, especially because, I mean, as you know, that fell through, but that also fell through alongside what was then the foundations of the EU itself, so the European Coal and Steel Community, how that was building up and how that was the success of that economic initiative. Also being focused on integrating European economies about coal and steel so that they wouldn't be able to go to war with each other as the kind of the post-war foundation for the EU itself. Do you believe that it would be relevant to have these 2 treaties coinciding, or would they start to interlace with each other in some way?
The organization itself will be separate, right? I mean, that's the whole idea. That's why you would do it, is to have an organization where only the countries that actually want to be part of it will be part of it. And that it can go beyond the EU in terms of member states that the UK can join, for example. So that's number one. The idea is that it's a separate organizations. You would probably have overlap, and you would need that overlap in order not to create an insane amount of bureaucracy. So how it could happen is that then, you know, from the line heads both of these organizations. The Commission is responsible for both of these organizations. That the European Parliament is part of both of these organizations to some degree, but that's all legal fiction. Like, we don't know how that will play out, right? Like, it's more of a thought experiment of what can we do to make defense in Europe work. Certainly the idea would need to be, let's not create more bureaucracy that makes it slow. It needs to be fast, and it needs to be able to act fast.
If there were to be another treaty, then would that then be a way to possibly circumvent these kinds of troublemakers in order to build up a European defense capacity more realistically and smoothly, and without that bureaucracy caveat that's continuously hindering European?
Yeah, that would be the idea, right? Is that you find ways to work around these troublemakers. I mean, Article 7 has never been activated, and voting rights have never been suspended. So it's very hard to imagine that this happens. And the EU and people working on the EU don't really have an idea of how to deal with Hungary, except that hoping that in 2026, I believe they have elections, that next year in the elections, Orban gets voted out. So the EU doesn't, I don't think people really have an idea of how do we navigate this, because like you cannot kick a country out of the EU. For that, you need anonymous agreement. I think the best leap forward is to say, okay, what can we do that is just for the countries that actually really want to commit and really want to build up Europe stronger. And that will probably need to be new organizations, new structures.
We talked a lot about Hungary, but even in the more Euro-centric countries like Germany, for example, we still see some kind of skepticism in the public. So do you fear that maybe the ReArm Europe initiative risks alienating the public to some extent, especially younger generations, where we see a really anti-militaristic and pacifist vibe? Especially, for example, if you look at the German elections with the really strong performance of the left party, Die Linke, in the young generations, which has run a lot on those anti-armament campaign. So do you think that we kind of risk to lose the public support, especially among younger generations, with the ReArm Europe initiative?
Throughout the past years, the EU's approval rates in European countries is remarkably stable. There's no really big dip. In no country, really, there is a majority to leave the EU, because we see what happened when the British did it. So that's number one, right? It's like the EU is remarkably, I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but the EU is remarkably stable in all approval rates. So no matter what the EU does, or has done in the past, these things haven't really changed that much. And I think the question about militarization or rearmament is also more of a national one in Germany, where, you know, with finally getting rid of the debt brake, at least in part, to allow heavy investment into defense, it opens up that possibility. But I mean, on the other hand, that's part of democracy, right? It's good that like there is this opposition to it. It's not a bad thing, and I think it's a question of who has the better argument, and who wins the better argument, and who manages to finally convince people. I of course hope that the argument wins that, yeah, well, we need to step up our defense in order to never actually be at war. Because this is not about us going to war. It's not about us, you know, now attacking another country or us actually going actively into Ukraine. It's about making sure that war never comes to us. And it's about making sure that we build up a credible defense for EU countries in the Baltics, in Poland and in Finland, which would be next on the list. The best pacifist stance at the moment is to make what's pacifism is making sure that war doesn't happen, and how do you do that is through a position of strength instead of a position of weakness. I mean, of course, also as a young person, I get the existential angst that you have about oh yeah, now everyone's talking about the military, we have the climate that is going downhill, we have so much that is, you know, where crises are happening all over the board. I understand that that people are anxious. I mean, if you look at the state of the world and the news, how can you not be anxious?
I thought possibly us having the ReArm Europe plan could feel like a threat to the US, and maybe also worsen our relationship in that way with the US and working together in NATO.
I would make the counter argument: can the relationships with the US be worse than they are at the moment? I mean, you know, the US. What does the US demand? The US demands us to build up our defense capabilities, rightfully so. The US demands us to invest a lot more into defense. The ReArm Europe plan and the national plans in Germany and Poland are an answer to that. So if you look at the logic of the argument, then they should be happy that Europe is taking these steps. But logic, I think, is something that is a bit far away from the current US administration. I think we are not in the driver's seat of making these relations worse. We are not the ones that are actively destroying the transatlantic friendship. Well, I think it's already destroyed. I don't think there's much that is there to be saved. We need to forge our own future. We need to forge our own path in the world, and that needs to happen without the US. You also see that with the tariffs, even the countries, even Italy, a country that was government is particularly fond of Trump, or maybe not fond, but let's say is rather close to Trump. They also get hit with tariffs. Everyone is sort of on the kill list of the US. Sorry for my direct language here, but and yeah, as such, I think what we need to do is to yeah, as I said, forge our own future without the US.
But assuming that does not come to fruition, and there will be, as usually with American politics, maybe a shift towards a Democratic president in 4 years, give or take. Do you believe that at this point, I mean, we don't know what's going to happen. Even like the geopolitical climate is more volatile than it's, I mean, been in my lifetime or my conscious lifetime, and I think for all of us. But do you think that it would be repairable? So do you even think that if there was a Democratic president to maybe get into the White House in 4 years, again, excuse my direct language, do you think that would be able to be repaired in some sense?
Yeah, I think that presupposes that there are going to be elections in 4 years.
Yeah.
I don't know. I hope so. I mean, again, I hope that there is something to be repaired, but ultimately it's a very good thing that Europe is lowering its reliance on US defense, regardless of who is in the White House. The US retreat from world politics, or the US retreat as sort of a world policeman, as it was in much of the 90s and 2000s, has started under Obama. And has continued under Trump, under Biden, and now under Trump too, is rapidly accelerating. I think this trend that the US is shifting its focus away from Europe, is shifting away its focus from Europe's immediate surroundings, is a trend that started long ago, and is now just rapidly accelerating. You know, France in the past has also had good relationships with the US, even though they invest all their money into French weapons. So I don't think that is necessarily an indicator. It's more what level are you on eye level, or are we actually sort of always under their umbrella, or are we actually sort of speaking on eye level about how we want this partnership to work? And I think in 4 years' time, who knows how the world is going to look like then. But if there is a change in the US government, I think it will be a good thing that Europe stands stronger and is stronger on its own feet.
One last question. You mentioned France. They are, as far as I'm aware, the only European country with an entirely independent nuclear arsenal. Given the role that nuclear deterrence played during the Cold War, and also the pretty large public backlash towards the deployment of nuclear weapons in some European countries, is there a possibility that should the US, for example, withdraw its protection of Europe, is there a possibility that the Europeans would consider expanding their own nuclear arsenal?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think Poland has made announcements that they want to pursue nukes in some sense. They want French nukes stations in Poland. I think that announcement came yesterday or 2 days ago by the Polish president. Yeah, absolutely. I think that is one of the consequences of this, is that because the US is retreating, the world will become more unsafe with more nukes, and countries, also Ukraine, will want nukes again as soon as the war comes to a halt where it can afford to build nukes. It will want to do so, because it's the only credible defense that you have. But ultimately, that makes the world fundamentally more unsafe, right? So it is not a good thing, but I think it will happen. It will happen, and Europe will need, either through a French nuclear umbrella that sort of replaces the American nuclear umbrella to some extent, or I mean, ideally that at some point will be placed under European, or at least partially European control as well, or more European countries wanting to build up nuclear weapons and the nuclear arsenal themselves.
As a young person in a similar age as all of us, who has managed to to forge your own path within this space that all of us, or most of us, seek to operate within. What kind of final kind of advice would you have for us?
I mean, I think we as young people, we are in. I mean, I think we are in such a terrible position. Like, if you look at what has been left to us from the generations before us, is a worsening climate, is an incredibly bad housing crisis. We will not be able to afford homes, most likely. Our outlook is, I think, over in the past, there was always this hope that parents had, like, our children will have it better than us. I cannot say that with confidence, and I don't think my parents would say that with confidence. At the same time, I was just last week, or the last 2 weeks, I was in Ancona at a conference organized by the Erasmus Student Network, and there was like 1,500 young people, my age, our age, I can say, that were there in at this conference, and it was so remarkable to see that level of passion, that level of energy, that level of motivation, of sort of inspiration and wanting the future, and sort of hope for the future, and passion for our future, Europe, the world. That really gave me a lot of hope, to see how much students especially are dream and what we want from the world. And I think, as silly as it sounds and as cliche as it sounds, this is something which is so valuable, and should not be, we should not give up that aspiration for the future and for building it better. We should not lose that hope, because if we become cynical about the state of the world, if we just become pessimistic and cynical about the state of the world, then nothing's going to change, and we're going to be worse off. We cannot lose the hope that something better is possible, and we should invest our time, our energy, our skills that we have into something which does good for the world, and does good for some people.
A really interesting point brought up by Julius was discussing the treaty establishing the European Defence Community, which was drafted in 1950. And the point of it was to make a common European defence. However, this went quickly south, given that France and Italy, two of the main members of the European Coal and Steel Community at the time, did not ratify. However, there's talk of restarting this project. What do you guys think?
So I basically think it's a really interesting idea to bring up the old concept, but the only thing I fear is that it might, to some extent, maybe threaten the members of the European Union who would not be part of this new treaty, like, for example, Hungary just pulling out and saying, okay, yeah, now that you don't want to work with us anymore, maybe we will just block the EU even more, and when you're basically left with only this new defense initiative. That's one thing I would worry about a bit.
Yes, and since this was also part of originally was part of the European integration kind of project from the very beginning, and a project that didn't end up succeeding that at the time, it makes me wonder if this would also be established within the existing framework for the European Union, or if it would be a separate thing. If it would be a separate thing, then how would it, for instance, be financed? It couldn't be financed through Eurobonds if it's not within the framework for the EU, for instance. So it makes one wonder a little bit of how, in what capacity would this project have in order to secure financing? And then, as you say, would it raise any contestations from member states that could eventually be excluded, such as Hungary or Italy, for instance, that have raised objections about the ReArm Europe project?
Maybe a quick solution to this could be considering it as one of the many layers of the European Union, treating it maybe like the Eurozone, where some states can opt in or opt out, or, for example, the European Economic Community, which includes some states exterior to the European Union, but still wanting to be part of this common market. So it would be possible maybe to have it in this category to exclude countries that aren't so sure that they want to commit their defense to this common European framework.
I think best is if we don't particularly exclude some countries if they want to still join. because otherwise maybe they could feel threatened by these countries having their own separate defense.
Since we were speaking of reluctant states, as for the issue of Hungary, potentially blockading, Hungary in particular, blockading certain actions within the European Council related to their objections to a potential defense community, there is already talk among some member states of activating Article 7, which would suspend Hungary's voting rights. However, they would need all of the members of the Council, excluding Hungary, to vote in favor of it. And we already have some member states like Slovakia that may or may not do so.
Exactly, and although Article 7 is there and in practice and very actively discussed, it's been actively discussed for a very long time. Since there has been certain member states of the European Union that have continuously acted in hindrance in order to, for example, provide aid to Ukraine. So any collective security or trying to accomplish a collective security under the European umbrella will prove itself difficult. So in the interview with Julius, then we were at times up in kind of lofty idea land a little bit, and that could, in my mind, possibly include an amendment or adjustment to the treaty on Article 7. If one wants to take away that unanimous clause, for instance, or if one wants to adjust it, certainly.
It's really the only solution we have, given that the other one would be to hope Hungary gets elected out of office, and given the current security situation in Ukraine, maybe we cannot be ready to wait for possibly quite a long time. The opposition has been gaining in strength, but given Hungary's regime, it might be very difficult. Without Hungarian solidarity in the face of Ukraine, Hungary's in fact actively supporting Russia via the continued trade with Russia, and their contributions to Ukraine has been insignificant. Actually, quite hilariously, their only aid to Ukraine has been sending liters and liters of holy water for their masses, which I believe sends quite a message about their reluctance to help and stand with the rest of Europe.
Julius also said that we need some kind of more creative approaches because we cannot just change the European Union. I think it's kind of similar to what we, for example, see in the UNSC too. You won't be able to abolish veto powers or an anonymous principle because you would, in fact, need unanimous approval of that. So I think reforming the current structures is really, really difficult. So we do indeed need some creative approaches, think a bit outside of the current box given by the European Union institutions.
And then there are also issues in some of the states that have been big supporters of Ukraine, with certain political parties that take a more pacifist tone rising in the polls, such as Die Linke in Germany. Admittedly, since the war, they have softened their stance somewhat on Russia in particular, but they still are not so in favor of the large military buildups that a lot of European states have decided is necessary to take due to the current security situation.
It's a democracy after all, and we need to respect those opinions. But I think it's a big challenge to actually convince the people that the military needs our support, and we kind of need the military too. Julius already talked a lot about the best state to be pacifist right now is to be strong, not to be weak, as bad as this might be. And it's not only about the industry, but also about the people. You need to convince them to actually sign up for the army, and to actually give the army also the public standing to be an appreciated part of the state, which sadly is not upon many young generations. So maybe any of you have some ideas on what exactly to do to tackle this impression, to get the people to sign up.
I think it really highlights the importance of the kind of journalism that the European correspondent is doing, especially because it's bringing voices from predominantly young people, people of a similar age to us, from local sources who can see what is actually going on and are connected to the people and to the voices and can amplify the voices of whoever might not have one in an area such as, for instance, Ukraine, or if you look at the student protests in Serbia or in the Balkans. Being able to bring these voices to light will also make it more defense of the European region may be perhaps more personable to some students. They feel a deeper connection to it if they see the actual people that are suffering behind this, and not just the politics behind it, and the bombardment with news and with numbers and with these like short headlines of people that you can't read what they think or what they feel, or it's being shown by the BBC and you don't trust the BBC anyway. So it highlights the importance of this kind of very close to earth and on the ground journalism that the European correspondent is doing. I think apart from that, then staying informed as young people about why exactly it is that Europe is upping their defense, what are the historical reasons for it, what are the political reasons for it, is also incredibly important, because if you understand why, I think people would be less adverse towards it.
I think as well there should be more acknowledgement and more easily available news sources for a lot of different people, so not only the academic people that can read all of the articles and that are really invested in politics, but also people like me, for example, who don't know too much and find it hard to, maybe for people who have like a 9-to-5 normal job, they cannot divide all their attention and analyze every article that has been written about it. But I think making the news much more available to all sorts of people.
And also to understand, as you say, that going to the army doesn't have to be a direct correlation to actually serving in an active conflict. And I think that that's something that that often gets glossed over or misunderstood, or perhaps people have an understandable fear of having to go to a front line, but in actuality, there's hopefully, if rearmament and readiness 2030 goes well, then there will be little need for that. So the more people collectively sign up, the less is the risk. Sorry, not chance.
Okay, maybe to add up to your perspectives, I also think that perhaps Europe taking more initiative over the nations themselves could be a benefiting factor, because what I see throughout younger generations is that people tend to identify more and more with Europe and less with their own nation. At least that's a general trend that I see, and I think a lot of us may be seeing too. So maybe Europe actually taking the initiative and showing, okay, we want to solve this together as a European Union could also help to make the people a bit more confident about this issue.
Just for a previous correction, Hungary did not send holy water, they sent communion wine, 500 liters of it actually, in June 2022.
Much better, of course.
With the message of supporting the Catholic community in Ukraine. So just after the last topic, we wanted to jump into European federalization. It's been quite a salient topic recently, given the security situation for Europe with regards not only to Ukraine, but also to the United States, that has decided to distance itself and maybe not provided the defense and reassurance it used to. This movement for the federalization of Europe is growing more and more amongst the youth, as observed by Leonard, and we believe that maybe in the future this could take place. What do you guys think?
I think when one talks about a more supranational Europe or federalization, it's important to think about how would that actually look and what could actually trigger it, and how because I don't believe that we're currently in a situation where we're going to see a big EU flag and that will suddenly mean the same as the American one. I find that very hard to visualize. What we do see happening, which is based in very much based in reality, and is not at all a lofty observation, is that the Commission is more and more consolidating power within the president of the Commission. If you look at how the college was organized in terms of the portfolios given to the new commissioners, it very much centralizes power within European Commission President von der Leyen. And then also, if now the Commission is suggesting collective borrowing for matters of defense, That's certainly, if one would say, an escalation or a movement towards a more supranational Europe. So if we do see continuous trends, whereas Europe is acting more together and decisively on these topics, I think it will be a gradual move towards Europe and the EU having more kind of supranational powers and moving towards a supranational rather than intergovernmental direction. But a federal Europe as such, although I have my personal my personal slightly positive stance towards that, then I have a difficult to see that materialize.
In a way, I think federalization in this particular time would be good because we stand more of a chance in the we have more power when we all work together and have same defense policies, for example. But I think we also live in an unsure time, and mostly in those times, what we have seen in history is that nationalism rises. So it could be hard for us to find common ground in all different, 27 different countries right now.
I think a more realistic approach, actually, I mean, as very well observed by both of you, would actually be confederalization, which is more based on how Switzerland functions rather than the United States. And the truth is, we're less further than what people tend to think, because the truth is, the definition of a confederation just implies that there is a central government and a common foreign and security policy. The only thing really distinguishing the EU from that phase is the common foreign and security policy, which is coming very, very quickly. I think it wouldn't be too pretentious, actually, to already define Europe as a confederation in the coming years if it is to really put forward a common defense policy.
It's important to consider that federalization is not a single moment where Europe turns a federal state. I think that's quite far away. I think it's rather a process of giving more and more power to the central government in Brussels. I think we also need to consider that the federal system is always something deeply up to definition, it has its clear definitions, but the federal system is not always the same. There are a lot of different federal states in the world which share a lot of different structures. How about military, for example, in Germany? None of the states have their own military at all, but the United States, for example, does see a national guard still existing at state level, of course, with powers of the federal government to federalize this National Guard. So it's not always just one concept of a federal state, which we have to follow in the European Union. But of course, Selina already mentioned, we are having struggles also in the time. Nationalism is on the rise, the far right. We have Meloni in Italy. We have Le Pen, or now, thanks to this awesome court order, maybe not anymore, Le Pen in France. We have the AfD on the rise in Germany. I think we have some extent of Euroscepticism, which we, of course, have to navigate in this complex and long process of federalization.
I think that Julius also highlighted this in the interview, but despite the rise of Eurosceptic parties, then the polls for support for the European Union within member states remains extremely strong. And this is also the voting, the numbers that vote in European elections is pretty steady and slightly rising, I do believe. But moreover, the polls indicating support for member states' membership of the European Union, but also within Europe as a whole, is either steady or growing. And this is happening in conundrum with the rise of populist parties, interestingly enough. And so I think one should not get too stuck in the populist or in the growth of populist or extremist parties, because these are all still, despite them growing, they're polling at around 20%, I believe. The support for the European Union is still markedly higher at around 50 or more, which I think is worth a perspective worth adding.
Well, then another question, would it be, if we're pretty positive right now, would it be realistic to have a confederalization or a federalization of the EU? How do we think it will turn out if it would happen?
Well, I think it should mainly be focused on the security and foreign policy aspect. We mustn't forget that the European states have, we do all share a common history, but we have different languages, different cultures, and there's some things that are a bit harder to completely integrate. I don't think the nation state is necessarily eroded. It would just be empowered by this collective agreement. I do think we can be both European and of our own country.
Some more glaring issues, I think, to add to that, which is fiscal policy. How would one conduct taxation within a federal Europe? Language, as you mentioned, very rightfully mentioned, I think would be another key issue. This is a huge undertaking. If you were to then to have an official, proper federal state, also, this would be a scale that's never been seen before. Also, because these languages that we're talking about, it's not like they're adjacent to each other, like was the case for the Soviet Union, for instance, where many of the languages that were related to each other in one way or another. There was some form of mutual intelligibility. That's not the case for the European Union. So I believe language and fiscal policy and defense policy to be the three main caveats towards a federal Europe.
Yes, I agree with both of you. I think especially what David already said, foreign policy, defense policy, those are the two things. If those happen, we can already speak to some extent a sovereign entity, especially on the world stage, because if we both have combined foreign and security policy, it is essentially sovereign to the outside. But I think there are a lot of issues connected to this. We, of course, have the question of the armies. Do we keep each member state with its own army just acting as a European entity towards the outside, or do we go for a completely European army? Prospect of army, of course, including the nuclear bomb, which you just already talked about too, but also including, in case of foreign policy, what happens to France's seats in the UN Security Council? Do we make this an EU seat, or does France essentially keep this and basically directs it under EU guidelines? So I think there are a lot of questions to ask about this. If we look back to the past, we can see that a lot of times those big changes have been happened in time of crises and in times of great pressure. I think we do experience those times at the moment.
I think this would be actually a great time to include my French perspective on the nuclear question. I do believe that nuclear sharing would be a great option. I do believe that in reality, France doesn't really have any reason not to share its nuclear weapons. Also, arms industry, with France being quite known for developing its own weapons, contrary to some states that have for a long time depended on the US. I think all of these could easily be translated to the European Union. I mean, an example of this actually was the Eurofighter. I mean, ironically, France did not participate in the development of the Eurofighter, but the Eurofighter is a good example of how Europe can come up with a common arms policy, and this extends also to nuclear weapons. Back on, related to the topic of federal Europe, actually, NATO comes up to mind, and recently it hasn't been NATO's best, and this really brings up questions on the future role of NATO, with the US really pushing for more expenditure, even threatening to leave. What future does this leave for us?
In a way, I think it's a difficult topic, because we, as the EU, most countries are in NATO as well, with the US. And I think right now, with US doing their own things and us still being pretty dependent upon the defense, it would be a good idea to work more together and as a kind of a sovereign country, and we could also show up against the other bigger parties.
Absolutely. I believe that the disengagement from, or a gradual disengagement from NATO is in practice a gradual disengagement from the United States, which was also one of the perspectives from which we wanted to conduct this podcast from the beginning, was the questions of gradual military disengagement from the United States. As you say, I believe that, if we want to be able to stand on our own 2 feet, so to speak, both as a region, as individual member countries, and as a as a collective under the European Union, then it's very necessary to build up military infrastructure and to build up military capacity within the European Union. It is definitely a definite sign of disengagement from the Americans, but I, as you say, agree that personally I think it's for the better.
Thank you everyone for jumping into our podcast today. This was the 5 Brussels debunkers. Thank you very much for taking part.